Chances are you have seen this man's face, whether it's on shirts, or on flags, or on poorly done tattoos. But who is this man, and why is his face everywhere? In Rosario, Argentina, on the 14th of June 1928, the man in question was born, and that man's name was Ernesto Guevara, better known as Che Guevara. Guevara was born into an upper-class leftist family, and he studied medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. It would be at the age of 23, while still studying, that Guevara would fuel his desire for exploration and travel, as he took 2 long journeys across Latin America. These trips opened his eyes to the poor economic conditions that plagued the Americas, which for him showcased the failure of capitalism. He came to look upon Latin America not as a collection of separate nations, but as a cultural and economic entity, the liberation of which would require an intercontinental strategy. This new insight into the struggle of everyday life for Latin Americans convinced Guevara that he needed to do something to help. In 1953, Guevara went to Guatemala, where Jacobo Arbenz headed a progressive regime striving for social revolution through a major land reform program, where all uncultivated portions of large landholdings were to be redistributed to the landless peasants. The largest landowner and the one most affected by the reforms was the United Fruit Company, from which the Arbenz government had already taken more than 225,000 acres of uncultivated land. The overthrow of the Arbenz regime in 1954 and a coup supported by the CIA persuaded Guevara that the United States would always oppose progressive leftist governments. Through his experiences, Guevara's conviction strengthened that Marxism, achieved through armed struggle and defended by an armed populace, was the only way to rectify Latin Americans' poor living conditions. He left Guatemala for Mexico, where he met Cuban brothers Fidel and Raul Castro, political exiles who were preparing to overthrow the Cuban dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Guevara considered Batista to be a US puppet whose strings needed cutting. Although in planning Guevara was meant to be a combat medic for Castro's 26th of July movement, he was the star student in the guerrilla warfare training, with his instructor Alberto Bayo labeling him the best guerrilla of them all. On the 25th of November 1956, 82 revolutionaries would set out for Cuba. Landing in the Cuban province of Oriente on the 2nd of December, only to be immediately detected and attacked by Batista's army, leaving few survivors and Guevara wounded. Che and the few remaining men would regroup at the Sierra Maestra Mountains, becoming the nucleus of the guerrilla army. During Guevara's time living hidden amongst the poor farmers of the Sierra Maestra Mountains, he discovered that there were no schools, no electricity, minimal access to healthcare, and no more than 40% of the adults were literate. The rebels slowly gained in strength, seizing weapons from Batista's forces and winning over support in new recruits. As second in command, Guevara was a harsh disciplinarian and sometimes shot defectors. Over the following years, he had ordered the death of hundreds of Batista's followers. As a result, Guevara became feared for his brutality and ruthlessness. On the bright side, he also set up baker's shops, a field hospital, printing shops, and a radio station, which broadcast news to the Cuban people and provided radio-telephone communication between the growing members of rebels across the island. In the autumn of 1958, rebel victories in the south of Cuba set up a march to Havana. In the closing days of December that same year, Guevara's task was to cut the island in half by taking the Las Villas province. After just a few days, due to some brilliant tactical victories, the rebels controlled the province, minus its capital of Santa Clara. This would soon change though, as a suicide attack on Santa Clara would see Guevara and his men reign victorious in a decisive display, despite being outnumbered 10-1. With the rebels now heading for the capital, Batista fled for the Dominican Republic, with a fortune of more than $300 million. Guevara entered Havana on the 2nd of January 1959, with Fidel Castro arriving 6 days later to take control. The final death toll from the past 2 years of revolutionary fighting stood at 2,000. Guevara, who was the most educated of the men inheriting the government, became the brains of the operation. In the following 6 years, he would implement his form of guerrilla government, with the first priority being to transform Cuba from an agrarian into an industrial society in order to become self-sufficient. In 1961, he became Cuba's Minister of Industry. However, due to a lack of funds and an underestimation of how difficult a task this would be, the resulting factories produced low-quality products at extortionate prices. By 1964, Guevara was viewed as a revolutionary statesman of world stature and took a 3-month tour across the world to spread his anti-capitalist ideology. Increasingly disillusioned with the direction of the Cuban social experiment and its reliance on the Soviets, Guevara began focusing his attention on fostering revolutions elsewhere. In early 1965, he had travelled to the Congo with other Cuban guerrilla fighters in what proved to be a futile attempt to help the Patrice Lumumba battalion, which was fighting a civil war there. Guevara's Afro-Cuban force of about 100 men was constantly monitored by the Congo National Army and the CIA, which hampered their ability to achieve anything of note, resulting in a frustrated Guevara heading back to Cuba with his tail between his legs. After laying low for a brief stint back in Cuba, in 1966, Guevara would enter Bolivia incognito to create and lead a new guerrilla group in the region of Santa Cruz. Guevara and his other Cuban revolutionaries were untrusted by the local Bolivian Indians, seeing Guevara and the other Cubans as foreign white men. As a result, 0 Bolivian Indians were recruited. After some initial combat success, Guevara and his guerrilla band found themselves constantly on the run from the Bolivian army. In October 1967, the group was almost annihilated by a special detachment of the Bolivian army, aided by CIA advisors. Guevara, who was wounded in the attack, was captured and led to a nearby schoolhouse for interrogation, but after he refused to speak, he was shot. Before his body disappeared to be secretly buried, his hands were cut off. They were preserved so that his fingerprints could be used to confirm his identity. In 1997, his remains were discovered, exhumed, and returned to Cuba, where he was reburied. Guevara's legacy would live on long after his death, particularly with the left, as he was romanticized as a pop culture hero of anti-imperialism and rebellion. Those on the right, however, condemn his views and actions, seeing him as a cruel, murderous revolutionary. Regardless of how you view him, Che Guevara's image has become as recognizable as the Nike Tick or McDonald's M, with merchandise of his image being sold to this day, which ironically adds to the consumerist culture Guevara himself hated, not to mention the numerous monuments dedicated to him worldwide.